Hermeticism and the temperament and anthropological characteristics of the Malarusians or Kievan core tribe, as Dugin speaks of the tribes of the Eastern Slavic people, tribe in contradistinction to the Russian part or the Greater Russia. And I don't make any comparison to the literature of the White Russians or Belarusians because I'm not sure that I know any of their writers or that they even have any very remarkable writers. Supposedly the explanation for that is that they were so suppressed under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that the intellectually were prevented from creating a literature or from advancing in the arts in other ways. To start with, one thing needs to be said. The Wikipedia page and also quite a few authorities give a false account of the two or three groups. Let's just stick to two of them and forget about the Belarusian part, but only the let's just call them by the name that's most prevalent now, Ukrainians and Russians, which corresponds to Little Russia and Greater Russia. So these terms are originally map makers' terms, and looking at the different parts of the Eastern Slavic people, it was said that the core of those people, or the out of what was Kievan Rus until about 1200, until the Mongol invasion, that's the core, clearly. And then there's sort of a spreading out of these people into the Greater Russia, which is Muscovy, which is then identified with the Russians, and to the other people which were later absorbed along with the Ukrainians by the Poles and Lithuanians. And still in Lithuania there's many of the so-called White Russians or Belarusians. The Wikipedia page and many people say that these terms mean something else aside from the core and the outside. But in any case, let's step that aside. That's basically false. And if you want to ask somebody who's looked into it deeply, you can talk to Vladimir Brovkin, who's a native born Russian speaker who's come to at Harvard University for a time, but he had a bit of a temper, which I think is also a cultural issue to some extent, because the Slavic people tend to be in a way more serious in their demeanor than do Americans. For example, this pushing of the telling people to smile all the time, which Americans do, and which plays a role in the Pan Am smile, plays a role in the spread of global capitalism. So basically, this I wanted to give, if we are to advance in knowledge, we need to constantly look at the available records and also consider the available witnesses of Dasein who give testimony to what they see. Every testimony is the testimony of a Dasein. It can't be otherwise. It's in a certain sense, the word subjective, therefore, can only really mean that some views are regarded as fanciful or out of keeping with reality by some other Dasein. So we have here going back into the 19th century, you have the core tribe, as it were, and the other tribes of these Eastern Slavic people at odds for the reason, which is, again, another thing we should dismiss, is this fault. There's some truth to it in a sense. Is one facet of the gem, so to speak, but only one small facet, which is this kind of Samuel Huntington Clash of Civilizations, whereby we say, oh, there were some Catholic influence especially on the Ukrainians and the Belarusians, and then this accounts for all the desire to break off of those people, their nationalist movements. That's quite false, because it's not absolutely false. There's some truth to it, but it's essentially false, because the real issue is that to be Russian was, for anyone in the past, and especially for people who were illiterate, which was the greater part of the population, 60% of people in Moscow in the year 1900 were illiterate, was Russian and Orthodox were the same thing, basically. If you're Russian, you're Orthodox. And there's the very concept of, let's put it this way, the concept of a Russian as possibly being something else, juridical national Russianism didn't exist for most people. They didn't have the sense that you could, or that there could be, Eastern Orthodox could be conceptually separated from Russian. So, and the same thing in Malorussia, in the core of Russia, in Ukraine, same thing. Most people didn't make that conceptual, it didn't even occur to them as a possibility. But once it occurs to us as a possibility, because we're reasoning beings, then there's a different situation. Even if you refuse it, even if you take a choice, in this sense, of this Kantian sense of to be autonomous, or in Heidegger's sense, this Eigentlichkeit, the so-called authenticity, which means that you freely take the choice and say, this is how I'm going to be. And then Dugin has another version of this with his this nous, how is it called? The noomachia, this war of nous, war of mind, this term which occurs already in the early part of the Odyssey to describe Odysseus and his fellows coming into contact with all kinds of different nous of different peoples, different dwellings, different Dasein dwellings, different cultures, we call them now. But there's no concept of that for most people prior to the 19th century, and the big watershed moment is, of course, the 1848 revolutions, where everybody, and many circles, especially of the intelligentsia, not just Catholic circles, but widely, it becomes clear that there's this conceptual possibility to distinguish between being Orthodox, we're the Orthodox people, and nationhood. So this is partially why Dugin is against nationalism, because this means a sort of atomization, a sort of breaking apart of the Orthodox, put in these Zizek Islamic terms, the Ummah, the whole, Zizek likes to talk about Islam in a certain somewhat superficial way and talk about the Ummah. But say there's something corresponding to that with the Eastern Orthodox. The nations would then, when taken seriously as a point of chosen identity, mean breaking apart that primitive unity of the Orthodox Church and of those people. So the awareness of this, once this awareness comes in and floods everything in the 19th century, then there's a lot of motivation for pushing the already existing temperamental differences. So the thing I wanted to give testimony to, which I needed that preamble to get to, or that preparation to get to, preparatory exposition, is Ukrainian writers as a demonstration of the core temperament versus Russian writers as a demonstration of the outlier temperament. This again corresponds exactly to, despite what you read everywhere and what the experts say, it's a map maker's term, and it corresponds exactly to the usage of the Prussians who described Klein Deutschland as the core, the Emperor Wilhelm I at the center, radiating the Germanish character, the Germanish dispensation in history, or providence, and the so-called Gross Deutschland, all the other German speakers, Austria, Sudetenland, whatever. So that corresponds exactly. And so we have, and you can see that there's probably a greater difference between Austrians and Germans. There's quite a great difference in temperament, and actually, although it's not so important in DNA, there's a great difference. We have Gogol, Dead Souls, and one can see the, I wanted to superimpose onto Gogol and Fyodor Sologub, or Sologub, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name, but I'm thinking of the book Petty Demons, which is, so his parents were, or at least his father was a Ukrainian peasant who became a tailor or something like that. But he clearly carried over the Ukrainian Dasein into Russia, so we shouldn't confuse him with the Russian writer in this sense, is what I'm claiming. And you can totally see in the character of their writing something which is very different from what we usually get from a Tolstoy, from a Dostoevsky, from the great Russian writers, Chekhov, and so on, Turgenev, so forth. There's one, but the interesting thing is that Sologub resonated very powerfully among the greater Russians. So that's the other thing I want to say. I think the difference between these tribes, so-called, is much closer than that between the Austrians and the Germans, for instance. That's very much further, and not just because Austria is a Catholic country, and at least most of Germany, aside from the so-called degenerate Oktoberfest South, which came in after the Franco-Prussian War, is been Protestant for 500 years. Not just for that reason, but also somehow, this Habsburg people and the Hohenzollern people have a different temperament, and it's a greater difference than is the difference between these Slavic groups. So I would bring this out by saying, one, you could see that how basically the Russians have taken over Gogol, taken over the guy that did the Black Square, the early 20th century avant-garde, Malevich, and Sologub as their own, because they sense the inner identity with the what I want to superimpose over that is this notion of a thrice great Hermes, this Hermes Trismegistus. This has a special tone. Hermeticism has a special tone which goes to the core of existence in such a way that you see in core people, which are in a certain way apocalyptic people, revelatory people are produced from this. So, and then I give a example where only in a few moments in Dostoevsky, actually the only one I can think of is in Dream of the Ridiculous Man, in the actual dream itself, where if you look at the dream, what he's saying there has a hermetic, apocalyptic character, where you see in a great transparency the same kind of vision that you're getting in a sort of fabulous way in Dead Souls, in The Petty Demon, and in the probably, because I don't have a thorough knowledge of Ukrainian writing, probably in other places. So if other people would look at that, maybe they would see the same thing I see. Maybe they won't. Many people would say, oh, but that's just subjective. But then again, that gets into a whole nother issue, which I eschew to go into now. But my view is that's a lot of nonsense talk, because everything is the view of one Dasein, comparing it to who assumes that other Dasein exist, and then says, look at this. You look. Some people say, yes, I see what you see. Some people don't. Some have a more gripping vision of certain things, and there's no way around that. So you always have to have someone who sees something, who maybe sees it with a greater keenness and sticks with it, and then points it out to others, and maybe they see it as well. That's true in experimental science. That's true in for the first beings who conceived of mathematical objects, and then through some miracle were able to connect up what they saw in their inner vision and demonstrate it, somehow give expression of it to others, so that it became a common possession of a group and a common pursuit of trying to get to the truth. On this subject of nohomachia, I think it's interesting that if we go through these steps, through a sort of step where there's no concept of the division between, say, a Russian and an Orthodox, basically this is something you wouldn't think about. Then you think about it, then you think there's this possibility of different blocks. And then what Dugin is doing is saying, here's the place where you would be at, if you had thought through